Hello fellow YouTubers and Ducati lovers. Yes, I know this is not a Desert Sled. It is the beginning of my story. It's an icon from 2015, I believe, and it taught me that it wasn't really good enough for taking on gravel roads. So I figured I should swap it for something taller, which turned out to be a Hypermotard SP from 2014. And that's a kick-ass bike. I really love that. And the whole idea was to convert it into something of enduro style, changing the wheels and softening suspension and do a little bit of tweaks to make it possible to take it out on dirt roads. But before I got that far in my modification of this beautiful bike, in 2017 Ducati launched the Desert Sled Scrambler, which was really the scrambler they should have done in the first place. A scrambler that could scramble in the dirt roads and timber lanes and off the beaten track. So I simply swapped my Hypermotard for a Desert Sled. But before I did, I started to play around with Photoshop to see what one could do with the Desert Sled to make it look a little bit cooler. And this is what I came up with, and that's the style I've been trying to mimic in real life. So come 2019 and I get myself a Desert Sled from the previous year with 0 on the clock. And I immediately fell in love with this bike, although it is a tad bit heavy. So Ducati, if you're listening, this bike doesn't need more power, it needs less weight. So this lovely lady of mine, she's a tad bit overweight, so I started to figure out how we can deal with that. And the first thing I did was to remove the passenger foot pegs and the rear mudguard and everything with it. That shaved off quite a big chunk of weight, and I replaced the rear mudguard with 2 metal brackets which held the license plate, and that was absolute rubbish. So I replaced the 2 brackets with a carbon fiber plate, and with 2 smaller brackets I attached the license plate to that one. It worked a lot better, but it still felt like a temporary solution. And in this image you also see that I removed the black part of the front fender, and perhaps most visible, I have painted the rear end of the saddle with spray paint made for shoes, and it worked surprisingly well. Later I also removed the heat shields from the exhaust, which I found really annoying because it was just always in the way. And you should never ride without proper boots anyway, so I did that. It looks a little bit cooler, and I also painted the end canisters black with heat paint. And this was a style I really liked, but I couldn't get away from the fact that this end muffler thing must weigh a ton, and it needed to be replaced with something lighter, which I will get to in another video. As you can see in the picture as well, is that against my wish to drop the weight of the bike, I've actually added engine protection bars that were quite heavy and rigid. And you can also see I've added hand guards from Evotech. Now Evotech usually make really good products, but I do not recommend these hand guards because they're simply too flimsy and soft, which proved to be the case when I dropped the bike, and I've done that twice now, and the handguards just bend. They don't do the job. If you're considering handguards, I would invest the money and get proper bark busters, which I know work for a fact. Here we can see that I swapped the aluminium side panels of the tank for carbon fiber ones that weighs basically nothing. If they weren't bolted to the tank, they will simply float away. And the original aluminium ones, they were surprisingly thick and heavy. And to be honest, Ducati, if you want to lighten this bike up a little bit, why not make a tank out of plastic or aluminium? I would buy it. Now the tank is made of heavy steel, and while you're at it, why not add a liter or 2? Because this bike could do with a bit more range, for sure. Perhaps a bit subtle, but in this image we can see that I made further adjustments to the saddle. I had a professional saddle maker actually shave off the top section of the saddle in order to make it flatter. And while at it, he also swapped the painted vinyl for proper white dyed vinyl. Making it flatter actually makes it more comfortable. Yes, it becomes a little bit lower, not that I needed it, but now it's far more comfortable than the original shape that would give you a wooden butt after about 20 minutes of riding. Again, Ducati, if you're listening to this, if you look at all the scramblers that have been modified, the first thing that people do is to modify the saddle and make it look slimmer. The original one is completely over-dimensioned to the rest of the bike, and it looks like a big couch, and yet it's so uncomfortable. Do something about the saddle, please. In this image we can see that I added some tank grip pads for the knees when you're standing and riding, and they do make a difference. After a bit of riding I realized they were not ideally located, so I did move them closer to the saddle. I've also swapped a lot of the original plastic parts for carbon fiber, which is questionable. It's a lot of money, of course, and you don't save a ton of weight really, but it looks cool. Most of these parts come from a Canadian company called Composites, never mind. And they have pretty good products, but the fitting isn't always that great, especially when it came to the engine casing cover there. They lacked the spacers and I had to fiddle around quite a lot to make them fit, but now they do, and they do protect the engine casing if you drop the bike. I mean, when you drop the bike. A pretty obvious weight saving hack is to swap the original battery that weighs like it was made of lead, and it is. So you can find much lighter and equally powerful lithium-ion batteries out there in the market. And this one has the same size, but it is a lot lighter. As you can see, it weighs just a quarter of the original battery. But I also later swapped this one for something that was about half the size, and it was still enough power to start the engine with no problems at all. Except if you put the bike in really cold conditions, then it's not that great. Another big weight saving hack is to swap the original catalyzer unit for an aftermarket part which has no catalyzer, but as I mentioned, I will cover that in another video. Going back to this image and the carbon fiber rear mudguard, I wasn't too happy about it because it looked awkward. I wanted it to follow the lines of the frame of the bike like this. But how do you deal with the tail light then? Well, you simply have to find an aftermarket tail light that is much slimmer than the original one, and I did so here in our local automotive store. This is a general tail light for any motorcycle. It doesn't necessarily go with a particular brand of motorcycle. I just needed to figure out how to fit it, which I did using two metal brackets like this. I'll most likely swap those metal brackets for carbon fiber dittos later on. A really cool thing about this solution is that the tail light is not visible until you turn the ignition on, and then it's clearly visible. Here you can see the carbon fiber mudguard which the license plate is bolted onto. It looks a bit homemade simply because it is homemade. Little lesson to be learned here as well is that if you want to bend the license plate a little bit, don't bend the aluminium, it will crack. It's much better to bend the steel brackets that holds the license plate. Here you can also see how I fitted the license plate light straight on to the license plate, and it works. Now the cable needs a little bit of zip tying, and again this is not the final end product simply because this mudguard is not wide enough. I will make an attempt to make it wider with some carbon fiber L brackets that I have on the shelf. Making the rear mudguard a little bit wider is necessary. I learned very soon from mucking about in the Scandinavian dirt. Equally important is to make sure that the tail end of the bike is dirt proof, which I first tried with a square piece of rubber. But that didn't work out so well, so instead I swapped it for a sheet of aluminium. I used 2 mm thickness and it was quite easy to work with, and I could also bend it and warp it to fit the bike perfectly. Another modification that I've considered to make is to completely remove this bracket which holds the original tail light and the original rear mudguard. It really fills no purpose anymore. It just collects dirt, so it might go, which means I have to cut it off, and I'm not entirely sure if I'm going to do that or not just yet. Another modification I've made to the saddle is to put a seal like this, a foam kind of seal that you put on windows, I suppose, and I put it alongside here. It's got sticky side, so I put it along the side of the saddle here. Stops there because this is where the tail light sits, so it won't fit there, so I stop it there. And this is simply, it gives a bit of an edge there, you see, and prevents dirt from flying up from the rear wheel. It's actually a mudguard idea, and it works. I've tried it before and it actually works. I'll see if I can make it even thicker this time around to sort of stop anything from coming in underneath the saddle. You can also see here that it's actually white spray paint in this area, and this is these are remains from my first attempt to make the rear of the saddle white, which I did with spray paint that is made for shoes. Some time has passed since we tried this neoprene window seal, and I put it in the saddle, but I was stupid and I used a high pressure hose, and I managed to puncture a hole here with a high pressure jet. I glued it shut now. It looks ugly, and eventually I will have to replace this whole panel, but I'm gonna wait with that until I probably rip it more by falling in the forest. This is also a cut made by the high pressure water jet, so be careful when you're using that on any saddle, I suppose. Just don't go too close. Well, that's pretty stupid. So I had it mended and it's all good now, but it looks ugly, which is fine. I will call it patina. So every time I've been out in the dirt mucking about, this whole tray here has been full of water and dirt, and some of it is also coming over here. I tried to clean it out. I'm using electronic cleaning liquid, which, well, like that, and just to make sure I'm not short-circuiting anything. Now I want to keep this free from mud and gunk, so what I've done this time around is that I fitted this rubber, this neoprene window seal here onto it. This is for my little luggage, which I keep in the back, so I can actually tuck it away if I don't need it. And this is the top section, which I added there, so it's quite easy to just hook on the luggage. And I'm just gonna continue. I'm working on it right now. I will put more of this neoprene. It will go all the way up here, but it seems like I will have to put some back on the saddle again, at least from about here, to try to make sure that no dirty water and gunk gets sprayed into this section. And I will also see if I can cover these holes, because it's incredible how it enters. I don't know, it's from the outside it looks pretty much solid. To be continued. Well, so thank you for staying awake through the nerdy details of the modifications of my Ducati Scrambler Desert Sled 2018. And the next video will be about the exhaust from MIV, which is not supposed to fit the Desert Sled, but I did it anyway.